that delivers for working people. Our starting point is that everybody who can work should have the right to work, but also the responsibility to work. And maintaining that at the heart of social security, we think, is important in maintaining support for the system amongst taxpayers who foot the bill. To work well, there need to be jobs for people to do. Yesterday's GDP data confirm officially that the Chancellor's expectations when he launched us on our current course were ill-founded. We were promised a sustained recovery and falling unemployment. Now, the causes of the failure will no doubt be disputed, but the fact of failure cannot be. The forthcoming budget really must finally address the need for growth. As both parties, I think, recognised after the Second World War, the possibility of work has to be realistic to underpin the welfare state. So, for those who are out of work but able to work, the system must deliver effective support back into employment, and it needs to encourage responsibility. It mustn't shirk from addressing irresponsibility, where that is a problem, through firm but fair conditionality. For people who are in work, it ought to be promoting aspiration, rewarding those who are doing the right thing for themselves, for their families, and for society. For people who are out of work on health grounds but could work in the future, it needs to provide help into the workplace. It needs to break down barriers to employment where they exist. For those who can't work because of illness or disability, the state should be providing support for people to live independently. I want to look at where current trends in reform and policy under this government are headed. Do they match up to that aim of a welfare state that's fair and credible to the hard-working majority? That matters for the future of welfare, partly because every reform that fails to deliver undermines the welfare state and maybe undermines our cohesion as a society as well. Let me start with the work programme. The labour market clearly is in a dire state. We were told at the time of the June 2010 budget that private sector job creation would outpace public sector job losses. In fact, in the last quarter, 13 public sector jobs were lost for each private sector job gained. It is a difficult time to be introducing welfare reform, and it's also a time when the success of reform is vital. But one thing that the very problematic labour market reinforces is that good welfare to work isn't just about people who've been on benefits for a long time. People who've worked hard all their lives, finding themselves now out of a job, very often for far longer than they would want to be. They want to be back in work. Now, the principles on which the work programme has been developed are, in our view, broadly right. They build on the last government's flexible New Deal, and I think they do so in a sensible way. It does make sense to use a black box approach to encourage innovation on the part of providers, and it makes sense to pay on the basis of outcomes. But poor implementation of those principles threatens the quality of the help that people will get to return to work. The National Audit Office has told us this week in a very critical report that the government is assuming 40% of job seekers will get into work through the work programme. They believe, they've calculated, and they're echoing analysis published by the Social Market Foundation last summer, that actually it's going to be 26%. As the report courteously puts it, the National Audit Office and the department take a different view about the best estimate of likely performance. Rather less courteously, the Minister said on Tuesday the NAO doesn't understand. Well, we shall see. They also point out, the NAO, that no IT system to prevent fraud and other benefits will be in place until April, and of course there was no piloting undertaken, no alternatives considered. And they also underline how serious the problems for a number of charities have been. I've spoken to a couple of charities this week who signed up in good faith last summer to the work programme with a number of different prime providers, and who now, nearly 8 months on, have not yet had a single referral from any of the prime providers they have contracts with, nor 1 penny in income. Now, you can't sustain an operation on that basis for very long. Charities were encouraged to believe there would be a kind of bonanza here, but before the election, we were at up to 30% of employment support being conducted by third sector organisations using specialist knowledge and focus to get the hardest to help into work. Ministers now tell us proudly that the proportion of referrals going to third sector providers is 20%. That is a fall of 10 percentage points, not the big rise that was promised. And third sector providers are dropping out altogether of the work programme, not surprisingly. In its launch in May, there were 508 signed up. At the stock take last August, 423. And I'm going to be very interested indeed to see the results of the new stock take, which is to be undertaken next week. The NAO report has also revealed what ministers were unwilling to tell me in answer to parliamentary questions, that the DWP has so far paid out over £60 million in early termination penalties for flexible New Deal contracts. And it's very clear that, not surprisingly, in the early months of the work programme, performance was poor. It took some considerable time for it to get going properly. If you look at the period of transition from flexible New Deal to work programme, my estimate is that 86,000 people who would now be in work if the previous arrangements had remained in place are not now in work, and that's one of the reasons why unemployment declined so steeply in the last year. That assessment is based on published data for the number of people who leave benefit every month. That is the only data we have. Last summer, the government's white paper on open services, with a forward from the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, rather influential people within the government, you would think, said this: providers of public services from all sectors will need to publish information on performance and user satisfaction. In the case of the work programme, however, providers have not been required to publish performance data. In fact, the Minister actually banned providers from publishing performance data. The providers I've been speaking to all want to publish data. They want to know how they're getting on. They want to be able to benchmark themselves with others. They want to tell partners like local authorities what's happening in their area. Until now, extraordinarily, I think, they have been banned from doing so, with the warning that if they do, they risk losing their contract. So I very much welcome the announcement the Minister made on Monday, under unrelenting pressure from the opposition benches in the House of Commons, that he will now lift the ban. But there should never have been a ban in the first place. And one of the damaging consequences of the ban is that local councils have not known what's happening in the work programme in their area. The Minister said in the House on Monday he would publish guidance before providers can publish anything. I just hope he gets a move on before lack of information creates further problems. And I also think that the other part of the commitment in the Open Services White Paper needs to be implemented as well. Customer satisfaction data for the work programme should be published too, and I've tabled a question this week to him about that. Looking forward to publication of the first rounds of the official centralised data, initially referrals data in February, then outcomes data from October. I'm worried that transparency will remain an issue, because answers to questions we've been asking suggest that the scope of these official statistics may not be sufficient to make a proper assessment of the scheme. And for this black box approach to work, and we support the black box approach, there does need to be rich data about what the outcomes actually are in order to assess the performance that is being delivered. It is not clear that that is going to be the case, and I wonder whether that is another consequence of the rushed implementation of the work programme, which I think was very damaging in terms of that early poor performance, and indeed that the NAO has drawn attention to this week. I must say, I think it is a mistake to be relaxed, as ministers say they are, about prime providers going bust. The resulting tumult would badly disrupt support for people who want help to get into work, and there are costs to that. Now, I'm not saying that failure of a provider would be catastrophic, but it certainly has to be planned for, and there's no sign that I've been able to extract, again, as a result of asking a number of questions about this, but there are plans in place for that eventuality, which, if the NAO turns out to be right, is not so much a possibility as a certainty. And if prime providers don't go bust, but instead increase either caseloads or reduce standards, cherry-pick easy cases, then we will see a serious deterioration in the support that is on offer. These problems with the work programme are for the most part to do with implementation. I don't think they are fundamental to the scheme, but getting them wrong will mean that unemployment is going to be higher than it needs to be. Looking at the Welfare Reform Bill, which introduces universal credit, we're moving beyond issues of competence into issues of fairness. Again, the principle of universal credit, in my view, is sound. I think bringing lots of different benefits into a single system has a lot going for it. It should simplify the system. It should make it easier for people to understand the position that they will be in if their circumstances change. In government, we did a great deal through the national minimum wage, tax credits, the new deals, to make sure people were better off in work. So I welcome the aim of universal credit, to continue that through a unified taper, to simplify it so that people are clear that they will be better off in work. We support those aims, but universal credit also represents a terrific levelling down in terms of what it offers to people who are in work. Under tax credits, the second earner in a household, and we know the second earner is absolutely vital in determining whether that household's children grow up in poverty or not. Under tax credits, there is a strong incentive to get into work. That has been very significantly, or will be very significantly diminished under universal credit. At the same time, the support on offer for childcare has been slashed by a third in April of last year. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's one reason why women's unemployment is now the highest it's been since the 1980s. Under the out-of-work benefit system, as it's been for a very long time, if you have capital or savings above a certain limit, and you're not in receipt of contributory benefits, then you don't receive JSA or ESA. That seems fair. If you're unemployed and haven't paid in, you should be asked to use your savings before seeking state help. But the tax credit regime has always recognised if you're working hard, if you're saving for a better future for your family, you should be able to keep those savings while continuing to receive support. Under universal credit, though, the same very tight rules on savings that apply to means-tested JSA will be applied to universal credit and to people in work. Essentially, people will be told if you are on a low income, you have no chance to aspire to saving up a deposit for a mortgage or saving up for a child's education. And that seems to me to be quite wrong. And it's very easy, actually, to come up with an example of somebody who would lose £16,000 a year in universal credit support as a penalty for having £16,000 saved. And it frankly means as soon as people are in a position of building up a significant sum in savings, universal credit will be taken away, and their ability to save further will disappear. How can that be right? And while on the subject of universal credit, how deliverable is the October 2013 deadline for implementation? Now, we know the tie-in between universal credit's agile IT in the Department for Work and Pensions and the real-time information PAYE system at Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs is a source of serious concern in government. As a minister, by the way, I had responsibility for both those departments and their IT at times in the past. But this particular, the real-time information system, has been placed on the Major Project Authority's watch list of projects at risk of failure, and has been placed in a position that indicates a higher risk than that of the procurement projects of the Ministry of Defence, which might give some cause for concern. But it may just be me, I was very puzzled what the Secretary of State meant when he spoke about this in the House of Commons on Monday. One of my colleagues asked him this question: the information technology necessary for universal credit will depend on the Revenue's new PAYE real-time system. Is the Minister confident that every employer will be using that system successfully by next October? This was the Secretary of State's reply. We are working towards that. So far it has been a success. We are on target. We will continue towards that date. That is our expectation and ambition. So he wasn't absolutely unequivocal, but he was reasonably clear. A few minutes later, the chair of the Work and Pension Select Committee, my colleague Dame Anne Begg, asked him this: from what I'm hearing, HMRC's timetable for real-time information has slipped. It won't be ready to roll out universally across the country on the date that universal credit is introduced. What happens if real-time information is not in place on the launch date? And the reply was this: from the word go, we have not needed the full system of real-time information to be ready for universal credit. RTI will dovetail nicely with universal credit. We don't need it for that. We're not expecting it to be ready at the start of universal credit. Now, to my reading, that is completely contradictory what he said a few minutes earlier. He went on to say we were never expecting that. We've been working on that basis. But I'm mystified by what those two apparently completely contradictory answers mean. I've tabled a written question this morning to seek clarification, but I think we can deduce that the degree of confidence about all of this being ready to roll by October of next year must at least be in some doubt. People who are at work should be able as well to be confident that if they get sick, if they become disabled, the system will reflect that they've been paying into it. In exchange for years of national insurance contributions, it's right that people should be confident about receiving benefit according to the evidence about how long it might take them to get back into work. For JSA, that's the case. The 6-month time limit on contributory JSA reflects that around 90% of people getting back into work within that period. But in the bill, the government has introduced a completely arbitrary 1-year time limit on contributory employment and support allowance, and that will mean that support will be removed from people, from a significant number of people, we think, halfway through their cancer treatment, equally from others, people dealing with the first stages of multiple sclerosis, people perhaps struck by blindness. Now, the government has been defeated on that particular measure in the House of Lords with an alternative proposal that it should run for 2 years where it's needed, and we will argue very strongly that their lordships are right about that when the bill comes back to the Commons next week. The Welfare Reform Bill is underpinned by the view with which we disagree, that the system is simply a safety net against abject poverty. What we want instead is a system that encourages aspiration on the part of people who are willing and able to work hard, and that isn't, I'm afraid, where we're heading on the basis of this bill. And this is the dividing line between us and the government. We want to find more ways of rewarding and encouraging people who do the right thing. It seems to us the government simply wants to level things down. Of course, this is going to have to be achieved in an era of very tight fiscal constraints that's going to last for a number of years yet. That's why suggestions around assets, the idea that Ed Miliband put forward at our party conference last year, that your work record should count in allocation of social housing. That's an idea that we can explore. We also accept the case for a benefit cap, though not one that artificially manufactures homelessness as the one that the government is trying to drive through at the moment will. And the right to work has to be part of the equation as well as the responsibility. Many people are going to come to the end of the work programme and flow right off or onto long-term workfare schemes which, according to all the evidence, have a pretty limited rate of success. We think there are lessons to be learned from the success of the Future Jobs Fund, the Young Person's Guarantee introduced in the teeth of the recession, but successful in bringing youth unemployment down. It's a tragedy, I think, that was scrapped straight after the election, with today's record crushing level of youth unemployment as the result. A sustainable welfare state requires taxpayers who work hard, who fund it, to believe two things. First, that it's not going to waste their money, that it will demand responsibility on the part of others, but also that it will work for them when they need it, recognising that they've been doing the right thing. The direction of travel at the moment is wrong on this, on matters of principle as well as quite serious matters of competence. And our task in the Labour Party over the next couple of years is to show what we can do from 2015 or whenever the election comes to restore that credibility, and that's what we are determined to do. Thank you.
I've got one that Neil finds with up my sleeve, but I'm going to give you the chance first. The question that Neil basically posed was that you've outlined quite clearly some of your opposition points with the current government's regime, and you also made the point that it's very difficult to introduce labour market reform at a time when the labour market is so difficult. Well, Labour government had the opportunity, if you like, of reforming the system, and we actually had a relatively benign labour market. And I think it's fair to say that still found it very, very difficult to shift some of the people who have not been in work and long-term unemployed into work. And I was just wondering whether you've had a chance in the years of opposition now to reflect on what the Labour Party's programme was then, and if you were let's just ignore the difficult state of the labour market for now, because as Neil said, sooner or later it will get better. We won't just argue about how, but we'll also say we assume it will. What would you do differently, or what would you like to have a chance of doing?
Well, first of all, I would underline the extent to which we did reform the labour market in government, and did so successfully. And that's the reason before the crash, we had more people in work in the UK than we ever had before, and the lowest levels of unemployment since the 1970s. So I certainly wouldn't accept that we didn't have nor would I accept that the reforms we introduced were unsuccessful. Of course, I do accept that not everybody went to work, and there is certainly a significant number of people who were still to be helped. And as I was saying in my contribution, I think the way the work programme takes forward, it's an evolution from what was there before. The revolution happened in 1997 when we introduced the New Deal. What is on offer now in the work programme is an evolution from that, and in my view, a perfectly sensible one. I hope in due course it will prove to be perhaps more efficient than the New Deal was. But it's an evolution, not a revolution. But my point is that the transition from where we were to where we are now and where we're going to be in the next couple of years should have been much, much better planned than in fact it was. That's really what the NAO has said in its very polite way this week. And the fact that it was so botched, I think, that we're going to pay a price for. Should we have done more? If you look back to 1997, there was no help available for people on incapacity benefit to get back into work. There was no requirement or even encouragement to get back into work. We had to invent that completely from scratch. Originally, we had the New Deal for disabled people. I was responsible for that for a while, about 12 years ago, and we learned some lessons from that. That then developed into the Pathways to Work programme. We learned some more lessons from that. They've been reflected in the work programme. But that was a process which I regard as a successful journey, albeit not one that was complete by May 2010.
Thank you. Any other questions? Or questions from the floor? We've had a long day. We've discussed issues, but this is your chance to this sort of question the opposition, or even to air your points about any of the other speakers earlier today. In which case, I'm going to call it an end there. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.